Here are the facts. Around 3000 BC, dynastic Egypt appears almost out of nowhere. Artistically and architecturally, it starts simply. No stone structures, but massive mud brick tombs, and small but accomplished stone and ivory artifacts. Yet it would appear that the sciences are already intact and fully developed. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, the complex enigmatic funerary texts. That knowledge is the legacy, and it takes but a few centuries to bring the execution of that knowledge architecturally and artistically to perfection.
From a time stretching back into murky prehistory, the art and architecture of ancient Egypt stand as proof of an almost supernatural control of the material world and an eerie understanding of the secrets of nature and the laws of beauty. Nowhere is this more apparent than at the Cairo Museum, where hundreds of thousands of priceless treasures paint a very different picture of our distant, supposedly primitive past. Present at the very beginning, the supremely refined craftsmanship, the impenetrable materials, the harmonic proportions, and the esoteric content embodied within each work speak to millennia of development and evolution. In these enigmatic treasures, we see the telltale signs of the legacy of high knowledge and ability from pre-antiquity, which empowered the ancient sages, architects, sculptors, and scribes to realize timeless masterpieces which were simultaneously instruments of powerful magic.
The Cairo Museum is a treasure trove, a kind of a giant warehouse filled with masterpieces. Within it, we find bits and pieces of direct and indirect evidence supporting our hypothesis of the lost civilization. We find, for example, little stone bowls carved from some of the hardest stones known, porphyries and granites and green schists and diorites, that are beautifully designed with narrow necks and hollowed in the center. Now, we could not, with our machine tools, produce these stone bowls, and yet they date from earliest Egypt, first dynasty, pre-dynastic Egypt even. The other finds from these periods show relatively simple pottery, fish hooks, combs, artifacts of that sort. So we are suggesting that it is just possible that these extraordinary bowls, which, as I say, we couldn't do today, are artifacts from that still earlier, highly sophisticated civilization. Left to themselves, if they're not destroyed, they're virtually eternal. They won't weather, they won't erode. There's nothing really to break them up. And so we're suggesting that, quite possibly, these were heirlooms handed down over the generations. What they were intended for, we don't know. All we know is that they're carved from stone. We could barely work today. We wouldn't know how to hollow them out. We don't know what they were used for, but there they are. Beautiful, elegant, mysterious. These are some of these remarkable stone vases. Some of the most spectacular are actually elsewhere in the Petrie Museum in London, and if you're at the Louvre, take a look, see what they have there. But you see what's involved here. I mean, this is perhaps the most remarkable. This one and this one. That's a porphyry, which is a impenetrable stone. You know, I mean, these things have hardnesses. Yeah, well, this one's relatively easy in the sense of hollowing it out. I mean, it's beautifully done, but you can see how you might do that with some sort of a hand drill. This is something else again, because it's hollow on the inside, and the thickness of the lip is pretty much the thickness of the wall. These things are perfectly formed. Nobody knows how to do it. We don't know how to do it today. And the point is that this is the interesting bit, these come out of either earliest dynasty Egyptian finds or pre-dynastic finds. In those Neolithic settlements, that's what you found, was very crude pottery and little fish hooks and combs and stuff like that. And then suddenly these things. So it was Paul Roberts, my friend Paul Roberts, who suggested, hey, maybe these are heirlooms from that earlier period, because it doesn't figure that if the rest of the stuff that you're doing are crude little pots, suddenly there's this thing involving a technology, and I mean perfectly geometric. I'm sure if you did a geometric study of these, you'd find golden section ratios and all sorts of stuff like that. I mean, these are complex shapes. I mean, it wouldn't be complex on a potter's wheel. And that's diorite. Well, these are all. That one's a green schist. That's a porphyry. These things are, modern sculptors with machine tools would think twice before they attacked something like that. And if they attacked it, they'd be very hard put to get a finish on it like these. Look at that porphyry bowl. It's mind-blowing. So we're thinking that quite possibly these things are handed down because they're indestructible. As long as they don't break or you don't lose them, they're there forever. You leave them out in the weather forever and nothing's going to happen to them even. So this could be an intriguing part of the puzzle. And if it's not a part of our puzzle, then it's absolutely sort of inexplicable in terms of what else they found in these little Neolithic settlements. This is important stuff. The stones used to produce these bowls, and also some of the other statues of Egypt, almost defy modern technology. There's a hardness index. The hardest mineral known is diamond, has an index of 10. Next is carborundum. Steel files have a hardness of 6. These stones are harder than steel files. The Egyptians are supposed to have had only copper tools to work these stones into shape. This is difficult enough, almost unimaginable, as far as the sculpture is concerned. When we come to hollowing out stone bowls carved of these materials, it beggars the imagination, and yet there are the bowls, and there are the statues. Further evidence, we think, although we can't really prove this, is the esoteric message enshrined within some of this magnificent sculpture. Seen one way, we have, for example, in the Khafra statue, Horus protecting the king. Seen another way, we see Horus as the principle of salvation, or return to the source, assimilated into the consciousness of the king. So we have a portrait of the divinized, or exalted, or self-realized human being. Two different ways of looking at exactly the same statue. This is carved out of that special kind of diorite. I said that in indirect lighting glows. I mean, this is an impenetrable rock that when sculptors see this and they look at the finish on it, and you look down even from here, you see where the light is on it? I mean, it's a perfect finish. There isn't a ripple in it. It's almost unbelievable. But one of the really interesting things about this one, as far as I'm concerned, is when you look at it, if you look at it head on, all you see is the king, right? It's only when you get around to the side, that you see the falcon behind his head. Now the falcon represents, of course, higher consciousness, the return to the source, salvation, blah, blah. But the message, to me, is a very deliberate one on the part of the sculptor. He didn't have to do it that way. He can show the falcon bigger. You see even the way the falcon's wings are smoothed down into the headdress so you can't see him. So, in other words, enlightenment is not obvious. In other words, from the front, just a king, a very royal king. But from the side, and it's usually said Horus is protecting the king. The king doesn't need any goddamn protection. What's really being symbolized is that he's integrated Horus consciousness into his own. If we look at these magnificent specimens of Old Kingdom art and realize that these are not just works of genius sculpture, but that they enshrine a highly sophisticated metaphysical and scientific doctrine, we begin to realize that ancient Egypt is not as we have been taught, and that this doctrine could not have been developed within a couple of hundred years, and is almost certainly a legacy handed down over the generations from that still earlier civilization.
A strange and very provocative relic from earliest pre-dynastic Egypt is the Narmer palette. Underlying its enigmatic symbolism is evidence of a highly developed science integrating stoneworking, astronomical, astrological, and even magical disciplines. By enacting the domination of his enemies, by carving it in stone, King Menes was magically assured of victory.
This is called the Narmer palette. Narmer is another name for Mena, or Menes, who's unified Upper and Lower Egypt in dynastic times. Normally said to be a victory over the enemies and all this sort of stuff, and as I mentioned on a number of occasions, the unification of Egypt is supposed to be a purely political measure. This is First Dynasty, supposedly, the beginning of the First Dynasty. I mean, you see the Hathor ears up ahead there. I mean, the Hathor face, again, already intact with the cow ears, and the human face with horns there, instead of normally with the Hathor head, you have the headdress and then the sistrum on top. This may be an earlier form, but Hathor is around from the very, very earliest time. Now, these guys in the center, that's sort of interesting. For those who think, I mean, these occur here, and to the best of my knowledge, nowhere else in Egypt, again, ever. And okay, they're mythological animals. There are some people who think, gee, this is a long, the dinosaurs lasted longer than anyone thinks, and that if you're trying to draw a dinosaur by memory, well, who knows? I mean, I certainly would not like to get up in front of the American Society of Rationalists and try to defend that point of view, but it's peculiar. And there is one Egyptologist, actually, who is reading this as an astronomical text, in other words, as the ingress into the age of Taurus, which is about 4000 BC. I like that. But already here, First Dynasty, you see Horus and the papyrus swamp, so all of this stuff is there, absolutely from the very, very beginning.
Standing as curious evidence of an earlier common source for disparate cultures, the boomerangs used by the ancient Egyptians bear a striking and inexplicable resemblance to those used by the Aborigines of Australia.
There are hieroglyphs in Australia. There's a big argument over whether or not they're real. I can't go into this now. Those are actual Australian Aboriginal hieroglyphs, and these are the Egyptian throwing sticks, which are there. I mean, some of them whistle when they go, some of them are meant to come back to you. This suddenly gets interesting, because all of a sudden you think that maybe there is a connection, and that either the Aussies, Aborigines got it from the Egyptians, or the Egyptians got it from the Aborigines, but here they are. No mistaking that those are boomerangs.
An important piece of the Sphinx puzzle lies in an obscure corner of the museum. The inventory stela records a fact that unravels the traditional dating of the Sphinx. It records that the Sphinx appears to have already been a sacred and venerated monument at a date when its supposed builder, Khephren, had yet to be born.
This is the so-called inventory stela, which tells that Khufu, Cheops, built a temple to Isis alongside the Sphinx. I mean, the Sphinx is there in Khufu's time, and it's not built by Khephren. Well, he was the pharaoh before Khephren, who built the Great Pyramid, so that in and of itself means that the Sphinx is there in Khufu's time. So when did it get built then?
Wow.
The way that the academics weasel their way out of this is that studying the stone, studying these scratchy hieroglyphs, they find that the language is actually late. It's late period hieroglyphs. But the late period was consciously trying to, it was kind of a retro dynasty. They were consciously reviving the styles and all sorts of, all kinds of Old Kingdom iconography and Old Kingdom sculptural styles and artistic styles. They were deliberately reconstituting. The language had, of course, changed. So to argue that this is a late kingdom, sort of a late kingdom invention, really begs the issue. It's like saying that a 20th century translation of the Bible isn't really the Bible, because it's not the King James Version and it's not in Aramaic. It's a translation. So really, it's a very powerful piece of evidence.